another really exciting collaboration that we've brought in, and that is we've got a panel leader, Kimberly McCleary, who's the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Faster Cures, and she's going to lead a panel, and I'm going to let you, if that's okay, I'm going to let you introduce your panel.
It's great to see so many folks in the room at this hour of the day after such an exciting day one. Appreciate everybody getting here bright and early because the topic we have to share with you and that we want to engage with you on, we feel, is the most important one you'll hear about over the 2 days here together in Huntington Beach. And thank you to Nicole and Wendy and Carrie and the whole Global Genes team for this amazing conference and the opportunity to bring you this information that we think is so vital and really is the crux of a lot of the difficult choices you all make every day, and the ones that your physicians make, and the ones that drug sponsors make, and the ones that the FDA makes, and that we all make together. So here I've got some great colleagues up here with me this morning. Eric Gasho, who's the Assistant Vice President of National Health Council and a neighbor down the street in Washington, D.C., so we bring you greetings from the Capitol. Roy Zagami, who is both a dad and the founder and board president of the Sanfilippo Foundation for Children, and the inimitable, I think is what you were called yesterday. We can all come up with verbs and nouns and adjectives to describe Pat, but Pat Furlong, the founding president and CEO of Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy, who is such an inspiration to all of us. So I was going to start with a little story about a Japanese dinner, but I think I'm going to dispense with that as a way to lead into this topic. And do we have, if our PowerPoint wizards could help us out, we've got one slide deck for all of us. I think we'll go from Japan right to the cliffs of whatever place this is. And I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many people look at this slide and say, oh my God, what an adventure, that would be so cool, I want to do that? Okay. And how many say those guys are nuts? Are they out of their minds? They're going to risk their lives? Yeah, I thought Eric would be in the first group, but he's in the second group.
No.
And how many of you say, well, I need a little bit more information? How fast are they going? How high is the cliff? How much did the bicycle cost? Do the helmets really work? How many of you are in that group? So what we've just shown here is a patient preference study, a multi-choice decision analysis, best worst scaling from the health economics literature, or a poll. But it really demonstrates in this sort of dramatic way that when we think about decisions like this one, we're thinking about the benefits that we might get from that situation, the risks or the harms that might come to us, and also the uncertainty that surrounds things. And while our topic today is benefit risk, which is the structure that we use in the United States to think about drug safety and drug efficacy and your own personal choices and regulatory decisions, in other countries, particularly in Canada, rather than having sort of this bipolar system of is it beneficial or is it risky, in Canada they talk about benefits, harms, and uncertainties. And I'd just like you to keep that three-part system in the back of your mind, because to me and to a couple of others of us, we think that's a better sort of cognitive construct to put all of this information into. We'll see what we can do about changing the regulatory path to benefits, harms, and uncertainties. We could have the next slide. So it's a good sort of anchoring concept to think about the job of the FDA. And there's probably some education you will get over these 2 days about what exactly the job of the FDA is. Pat and Mark talked to us last evening about some changes in the regulatory pathway that they are trying to make for Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy. But it's important to remember that the job of the FDA is to ensure that products that are made available to the public are safe and effective. And that's a phrase, safe and effective, that many people think of as in absolute terms, that if a drug is available and it's on the market and my physician can prescribe it for me, it must be safe and effective. But really there's a lot of subjectivity, thank you, about that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. It's also important to remember that when we talk about the FDA and we express our frustrations with how slow things move and how we don't have access to more opportunity and medicines and devices, the FDA has a pretty big job. 25 cents of every consumer dollar are regulated by the FDA, and in addition to drugs and medical devices, they also have to regulate things like pet food, cosmetics, cell phones, our blood supply. So they have a huge task, and we were talking last night about it's not always the big bad FDA. Sometimes they really are there as a safety net. Let's see if I can get that image to build. Okay. But often advocates like those of us in the room find ourselves at odds with the FDA when there's a product that we'd like to have access to for ourselves or for a loved one. And the FDA determines in its assessment of the data that's brought to it by the sponsors that the safety and the harms and the efficacy are out of balance, that the benefits don't exceed the risks that they perceive for the population that would take that medicine. And you see this play out in headlines. Some of the decisions that FDA makes, like this one on Lemtrada, medication for MS that's available in Europe, but when the time came for the first review for marketing approval here in the United States, FDA decided that the risks were too great and the benefits were not sufficient, and that drug was not made available to MS patients. And there was a very loud advocacy cry to get access to that medicine. Another one that you might be familiar with was when Avastin was removed or withdrawn from a particular indication for breast cancer after it was approved on surrogate measures that later science didn't support its efficacy in that particular condition. And then, of course, everybody's familiar with the HIV story, and that's really why we as advocates have the opportunity now to influence regulatory decision-making, is because of the groundwork that was laid by the HIV/AIDS community many years ago to open up the pathways to get FDA the staffing it would need to make decisions faster and more responsively to the needs of the patient community. Pat, you've been very much on the forefront of these issues, and Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a condition. You spoke to the robust pipeline of products that are under investigation and nearing the end of the discovery and clinical trials process, but there's still a benefit-risk tension that exists with regulators. And for those who missed it yesterday or are still new to these concepts and could use a refresher, tell us about the DMD story and how the benefit-risk tension has played out in terms of what regulators are looking for and what the patients really want.
Sure. So Duchenne muscular dystrophy is an X-linked genetic disease that is progressive and debilitating. So children are born with muscle weakness, but it's not necessarily obvious, certainly not obvious often to the primary care or to the family itself. But it follows a pretty predictable progression over time where children will lose function, and by their late teens they really won't have any muscle function and have very limited movement in the hands and arms and wrists, and need breathing support and have some cardiac issues, which can begin early as well. And so the randomized clinical trials that are occurring now are really designed to see the safety and efficacy of a drug in the most expeditious way possible. So they're typically randomized controlled. They are typically looking at a primary outcome measure. And the primary outcome measure that has been chosen or identified by many of the sponsors is the 6-minute walk test. So the 6-minute walk test is basically asking the question, how far can you walk in 6 minutes? And it measures in a certain number of meters. Well, as you might imagine, in a progressive debilitating disease, as a parent, when your child starts falling and isn't able to walk 6 minutes, or even a minute for that matter, he's not eligible for the inclusion criteria. It's also limiting on the other side because young children they're distractible. Well, all of us are distractible, but in particular, a 4 or 5-year-old may not see the relevance of the test, may not really want to do it at all. And so the trials are often 7 years and above, ambulatory, and 6-minute walk test. So the tension is, why not everyone in the spectrum of this disease? Why don't we use patient-reported outcomes to understand what does benefit look like in a little guy? We know that from published evidence that children with Duchenne walk 30% less than their healthy peers. So could we put on a step activity monitor and monitor the number of steps that child takes over time? With an older, a young adult with Duchenne who isn't moving, it's really important for them to be able to use a cell phone and to be able to use their fingers. So is there a typing test? So what are the outcomes that we can use that are going to be relevant so that we understand the benefit and risk in this entire population? And when we talk about harm as well as uncertainty, there's uncertainty in benefit because we won't know the full benefit of a drug inside a 48-week study. We won't know the full benefit of a drug in this population for a long time. We also don't know the uncertainty. We don't know about risk. So when you give some of these drugs for 5 or 10 years, we don't know. And I think we've learned that as a community in corticosteroid use. At first, corticosteroids it's not an approved drug, but they were used widely in Duchenne. And now we're seeing 10 and 20-year effects of steroid use in these boys. So we're going to know over time. So I think the tension that we see is that trials need to be inclusive. Everyone deserves a chance to participate. And we also know in just preventative medicine, if you get something early, you're likely to achieve a greater effect than if you get it late. So treating babies, thinking about newborn screening in our future, treating babies, treating the ambulatory population, and treating those adolescents and young adults who aren't moving. Because every muscle fiber matters. And so trying to think about how do you manage that, how do you deal with that so that the label is also broad, because we would hate that a drug is approved and it holds a great deal of promise, and the label says that this drug has been tested and approved for an ambulatory population. So it's really about trying to examine the benefit and risk and uncertainty in this population in a short period of time, get approvals that are widely accessible by the entire population.
Great, thank you. What Pat has described, and go back to the slides, is really sort of an artifact of a traditional paternalistic system that Ronnie Zeiger mentioned yesterday. This slide is an image taken from a 2006 Institute of Medicine report that shows the traditional hierarchy of how regulatory decisions about benefit risk are made, with the FDA on the top looking at what are the benefits and risks for the whole population that might be served by this particular medical product, whether it's a drug or a device. And then if a drug is approved and available on the market, then the physician has the responsibility to decide whether it might be appropriate for patients in his or her care. And then at the bottom, you've got the patient who has to decide ultimately whether to fill that prescription or go forward with that surgery or take that chemotherapy drug and stick with that regimen or abandon it if it's not working out. But wouldn't it be nice if the patient were involved in the decisions on the top? Roy, you've gone through this experience, and the same kind of hierarchy plays out in clinical trials. I should say that a little bit differently, but FDA decides whether a clinical trial can go forward as a sponsor has designed it. Then the clinical investigators decide who they're going to enroll, and the patient ultimately has to decide whether they're willing to take that risk in return for potential benefits either to themselves or to the scientific understanding of their condition. So you've been through that with your son. Why don't you share with us a little bit about how that's played out in your family?
Sure. Yeah, I guess it probably helped to tell a little bit about my son and his disease. So my son Reed is 7. He has a disease called Sanfilippo syndrome, also known as MPS III. And it is a neurodegenerative disease. And if you sort of observe the progression, it's predictable like Duchenne. Up to 3, a kid may be completely asymptomatic, hitting all their milestones. All of a sudden you notice, hey, over the last 6 months, your son or daughter hasn't learned anything. And then they begin to completely plateau, and then they fall off a cliff about 4 or 5. I watched my son lose all his ability to speak. at about 6 months when he was 5 years old. And it was very frustrating for me, but also very frustrating for him. You know, watching him, it was almost torture for him because he knew he used to be able to say he could do something and it was taken away from him, right? And that's a very emotional thing for a parent to go through. It's painful. And so the progression of a child with Sanfilippo looks, you know, they follow their normal milestones, plateau, fall off a cliff, and then they essentially trail off for 10 years until the end of life. And, you know, so quality of life may be gone at 10 years old, even though they would live to 15 or 16, right? And so I think when we think about benefit versus risk, I think it depends on the context of the disease, of course, right? And I think there are so many ways that we can talk about benefit versus risk. I think the way people that from industry might look at it is when the FDA looks at a drug, how do they weigh benefit versus risk to approve it? And of course, we as patients care about that too, because we want therapies for our diseases to be approved as fast as possible, right? But I think, I don't know the numbers, like 150 therapies for the 7,000 rare diseases. I don't know, what is the exact number?
500.
How much?
500.
500, okay.
For 7,000.
500 for 7,000, okay. So for most of us that have a child with a rare disease, our only hope of, you know, affecting their outcome is to get into a clinical trial, because there's no approved therapy. And one area where I know my son has been impacted, and others with metabolic diseases, I know that I see Jennifer Van Houten out there. Tracy, her husband, is very passionate about this too, is the offshoring of clinical trials. Of course, when there's nothing for your kid, your only hope is to get into an early clinical trial. And what we've seen, at least with some of the enzyme therapies for lysosomal storage diseases, is that those trials move overseas because the burden for animal data to open a trial site in the U.S. is much higher than it is in Europe. So the fastest path to the market for industry is to go to Europe first, get some in-human data, and then come back for a pivotal trial in the U.S. And ultimately, that is whatever is the fastest route to approval is the right answer for patients long-term, but that doesn't make me feel any better, right? Because my son missed his chance to be treated, or, you know, to get a chance to get something to affect his outcome. And so I think benefit versus risk, it's sort of is something we have to think about all along. It's not just at the approval process. And even without an approved therapy, you're making benefit versus risk choices all the time. Do I give my kid this supplement? Do I try and off-label this drug to affect, you know, to help him? Even if there is an approved therapy. For example, for MPS I, for the severe form of the disease, a bone marrow transplant is a treatment option. Well, there's a 20% mortality with a bone marrow transplant. Do you choose to give your kid a bone marrow transplant that has a 20% chance of killing him, or do you enjoy the 5 or 6 years of life that you have with him? I know what I would choose, but there's no right or wrong answer, right? And then I guess the other thing I would say is that when we think about the role of regulators and government and impacting benefit versus risk, you can't prevent people from taking risks. I mean, you know, one of the stories I talked to you about was soon after my son was diagnosed, I was in the airport in Miami. I saw this little boy in a wheelchair, and it was obvious his family wasn't going on vacation. There was something going on. I started talking to him. The kid had Duchenne, and he was going to like Dominican Republic or something like that to get what his parents thought was a stem cell transplant. And the family had raised, you know, $50,000 to go get this kid something. I don't know what it was. And I'm not judging them, but my point is, maybe that was risky. I don't know. So you can't prevent people from taking risks. And in fact, Sanfilippo, for example, they've shown that bone marrow transplants don't impact the neurologic aspect of the disease. If you try really hard, you can get a bone marrow transplant for a kid with Sanfilippo. I can go find a doctor, and I can give my insurance company a hard enough time to pay the $1 million it takes to give my kid a bone marrow transplant, and there's no benefit. But I can do it because it's an approved therapy. So it's a really complicated thing to talk about. So.
Absolutely, and your story and, you know, so many stories here in the room illustrate that really tough choice that everybody faces on an ongoing basis, and as you said, it changes over time. So if we think about this pyramid and how to disrupt it, there are a growing number of advocates that are becoming involved in an effort to, change up the paradigm and to sort of break into a new mode. And Pat and PPMD are at the tip of that spear of seeing, if we build it, will FDA move into the house? What we're up against is illustrated by this slide. This is a slide I borrowed from John Jenkins at the FDA that kind of depicts what is in the regulator's mind when they have to make a decision about a new medical product. You can see there's a lot of things on that slide, and patient preference and patient expectations for benefits and tolerance for risk is just one of the many elements. And I can say that FDA reviewers are used to looking at everything outside that orange bubble. They have reams and skids of data that come in at the time that a new drug application is submitted, and they're not yet very accustomed to looking at that patient preference part. And there's not as big a body of evidence for that, and there's not as much capacity among the advocates for articulating their preference. So until very recently, the FDA has really only taken one look at what the patients are concerned about, and that comes at the very end of a long, perhaps 10 to 15-year process of what it takes to get a drug approved. And we saw slides like this shown yesterday, where a single patient will sit as a member of a review, an advisory council team of 15 to 20 experts, and they will be the one patient voice about the assessment of the data that they have on that particular product. Now that is a heavy lift for a single person to represent an entire patient community's difficult choices that Roy and Pat and all of you know so well. Can I see a show of hands? Is there anybody in the room that participates in the FDA's patient representative program as a special government employee? Great. Eric's going to talk about that in a minute, but I just wanted to see if that was a program that you all were availing yourself of. But before we get to those specifics, Eric, you and I have been involved in a process with FDA that they, in FDA's way, called the process consultation process. True story. And as Ronnie Zeiger said yesterday, FDA's learning how to listen to patients, and we were part of the team sort of preparing them for that conversation. Tell us about the experience and what you've seen over the last couple of years, just in terms culturally of FDA's readiness to engage patients in a very different way than this slide depicts.
Sure, but first I want to put this slide in perspective a little bit. You mentioned that patient engagement at the FDA has really occurred traditionally in one place, is at the review panels. If you look at any engagement that patients have had with industry, it also comes at the very end of the process when they're learning how to market their product to patients. But how many of you have an iPhone, an Android phone, some sort of smartphone, by show of hands? How many of you think that Apple is going to make modifications to their phone without first consulting with their end users? I would largely disagree. I think that they just announced the iPhone 6. It's going to have a larger screen. I don't think that was because you had some developer in Cupertino who thought that that would be good for people to have. No, they listened to people who wanted larger screen phones. You look at any industry outside of medical development, they are talking to who will ultimately be using their products, and we would like to see us get to a point where that happens within medical innovation as well. With that said, I think you are right. I think we are seeing a shift towards that type of environment, and I think it's been going back a little bit further than 2 years. We participated with the FDA as they did the reauthorization of what's called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, which essentially is an agreement between industry and FDA, where industry agrees to pay a fee for their applications, and in return, they get something in return. Typically, it's faster review times, but it can be other things as well. And when they did this most recent reauthorization, which was the 5th one, they actually brought the patient advocacy community up to FDA once a month to know what it was that we would want included in that agreement. And I think that we've gone back that far, and as it's been implemented, these consultation meetings that you're talking about, they're still learning from us how we think these processes are going. And I think we were really successful in actually having some more patient-focused provisions included in that, which I think we'll get into in just a second.
Yeah, so let's do that. There are actually in that bill that Eric just mentioned, that's part of a larger piece of legislation called the FDA Safety and Innovation Act, FDASIA or FDASIA as Dr. Hamburg calls it. That legislation is up for renewal every 5 years. So we are in about year 2 of the current legislation, but conversations are already starting to take shape for what do we want in 2017. But let's look first at what is in the current bill. And Eric, if you'll walk us through the patient representative program that I mentioned briefly, the patient-focused drug development initiative, and then the structured assessment of benefit risk and how that ties the other two together.
Sure. Actually, I'll start with the benefit risk framework. And so this is one thing that we at the National Health Council and others throughout the patient community really pushed for to have included in that agreement. And so what they've now created is a framework that allows reviewers to take into account the patient perspective on what their views on benefits and risks would be in a more structured way. The FDA has always had to weigh the trade-offs between benefits and risks, but often it was done just sort of by the opinion of the reviewer of what they thought that someone would possibly think, and not really written down in a way that can allow us to understand what their thought process was going into it. And I think that's really the biggest thing about this, is that when they approve a product, we can know what thought process went into their decision to do that. And that really is a powerful thing for patients to have, to really understand sort of how they got to the decision that they did. With that said, they need to be able to fill out that framework with the patient perspective. And so there are a few provisions in there that allow them to do that. The first is the patient representative program. I saw one person raise their hand who is participating in it. Essentially what it is a training system where they train patients how to be active participants within the FDA process. They can serve in a variety of functions that it'll help them be able to serve on the advisory panels that Kim talked about. It'll help them be able to serve as special consultants to the FDA and potentially to speak at any sort of meetings that they have. And so, it really is helping turn patients into effective patient advocates. And the third thing that Kim mentioned is the patient-focused drug development program. A lot of folks might have heard of these as the 20 disease-specific meetings that they're doing over the course of 5 years. Essentially what these meetings are is they chose a list of a little over 20 diseases. A few of them had a few combined. But what they'll do is they bring patients, researchers, clinicians, the folks from FDA who are making the review decisions, all together in the room to talk about a very specific set of questions to really learn what patients' views are about their disease, about the available treatments, what their views on benefit and risks are, what they might see as potential outcomes that they would like medicines to achieve. So really starting to get this information. Now, there's obviously a lot of consternation about the list of 20 diseases that they chose. I mean, they only have 20 meetings, and there are, as we know, far more than 20 diseases out there. But what I would like to have people think about these meetings as, yes, they are learning about these diseases, but more importantly, they're learning how to communicate with patients. I think that's the single most valuable thing about these meetings, is really creating a structured way for them to bring in patients, learn from them how they view their disease, how they view their available treatments, their thoughts on benefits and risks, so that type of information can then be used as they're starting to interact with other patients as well. The one other thing that I'll add was in the FDA bill was more resources for their rare disease program. That's obviously something that we advocated for as well. So we really do think that because of the process the FDA had to bring in the patient community as they were going through the process, we really got a far more patient-focused agreement than we had ever seen.
Thanks, Eric. And so we're 2 years into that more patient-focused PDUFA agreement and FDASIA law. Where are we with the 20 meetings? By the end of this month, the FDA will have hosted 10 of these sessions. I was pleased to be involved in a former role as CEO of the National Organization for Myalgic Encephalomyelitis, Chronic Fatigue Syndrome on the first meeting, and also as a member of the Unite Narcolepsy Initiative for the fourth meeting that happened just about exactly a year ago. So the 10 meetings have been held. It was really interesting. I've been to nearly all of them. Roy has been to the one that I didn't go to. But you could tell in the first 3 or 4, FDA was just really sort of off balance. They were stunned by the comorbidities that patients have, because they're used to thinking about patients in the spectrum of clinical trials where you've got one disease and you're sort of a pure population of people that don't have a lot of complicating factors that would make it difficult to tell whether a therapy was working. They were also sort of amazed by the number of therapies that people were using at any one time and had used over time to treat their disease or address their symptoms or manage other conditions like high blood pressure or depression that were concomitant with their illness. So those were 2 things they were just amazed by. They were hearing this and not really, I think for the first few meetings, able to process it. And then the third was how much across the diseases, pain, sleep, cognitive problems, and fatigue were really the impacting factors in diseases from HIV to narcolepsy to cancer. And those are 4 dimensions that we don't have good objective measures for, that are tough to go out and find a target to treat. So I think that's led their clinical outcomes group, their PRO group, to think about how can we build some measuring tools that will help us advance all of these diseases. So I agree with Eric. Just them having a greater capacity and an opportunity to talk to patients directly has really informed their thinking more than just about the specific conditions they've heard about, but as to how the FDA can bring some tools together. Roy, you were involved on your son's behalf at the meeting on inborn errors of metabolism. Just share with us briefly your experience in going to that meeting and what you heard from other advocates like yourself.
Sure. By the way, was anybody else in that meeting? It was okay, great. This is my perspective, obviously. I was a little frustrated by the questions they were asking. I mean, I kind of felt like they were asking the wrong questions, and you could tell when someone's asking the wrong questions when you get answers to questions you didn't ask your questions, right? One of the things they were, they kept asking about how to manage these diseases, and specifically the meeting was focused on neurological manifestations of inborn errors of metabolism. And if you look at this class of diseases, if you look at lysosomal storage diseases in particular, I guess I can't speak for all inborn errors of metabolism, but a lot of these are single gene mutations with a well-known pathway, which it's just, I mean, we have the science there to think about how to develop therapies for this, but there's just nothing there yet, right? And a lot of the questions they were asking are about how do you manage, what drugs do you give your kid to manage their behavior? So for example, we give our son Risperdal. I give my son Risperdal to manage his impulsiveness and to help him sleep at night, or amitriptyline to help him sleep at night. Those aren't things I want to give him. They have horrible side effects. He drools really bad from the Risperdal. I want to treat his underlying disease, and I think one of the frustrations I had were they weren't asking about what we would like to see in terms of a treatment for something that actually impacted the underlying disease. And like I said, I kind of felt like they were asking the wrong questions because they were getting answers like, hey, we really would like to see the clinical trials for the therapies that affect our disease here. Stop asking us about, do we give our kid Risperdal or whatever, right? Do we want to treat our kid's disease? I think probably one thing that was very shocking, actually, I think regulators can be shocked, and sometimes I think patients can be shocked by the questions that regulators asked, and a lot of these are anecdotes. This wasn't necessarily in the meeting, but when the enzyme therapy for MPS I was developed, I know some of the folks that were involved in the development of that therapy, and the FDA asked them, when they were looking at longevity data from the kids that were treated in that trial, well, how do you know that this drug is working? Don't some kids just get better? Well, Yeah, nobody with MPS just gets better. And I think the fact that someone even asked that question, it infuriates parents, right? And so I think it's really important for us to get in there and tell them, hey, this is predictable. They're going to go like this. They don't ever go like this and just get better. They're going to die unless we do something. And that is a really shocking thing to say. And I think it's, my son was diagnosed 3 years ago, and I can never imagine saying, if you gave me an option to stop his disease today, I would take it even if there's a 20% chance it would kill him. If someone came to me with a magic pill, this is all hypothetical, and said, Roy, you can give him this pill, it might stop his disease, he would become more manageable, but it might kill him tomorrow, I would take that pill. And I can't imagine, or I would give it to him, right? And I think that's a shocking thing for somebody who doesn't have a sick kid to hear, right? So, some of the things that came up that I think were interesting to regulators, all these neurological and neurodegenerative diseases, they have frustration in the patient to go along with it, right? I mean, you can imagine any of us would be frustrated if we had some skill and could, think through or speak or do something, and then that was taken away. And kind of one of the things that we saw across all these neurological diseases was as these abilities go away, there's the children experience frustrations. Actually, one of the questions I asked them was, okay, you look at Sanfilippo, and it probably impacts maybe 1,500 kids in the U.S., and some of the other MPS diseases are even more rare. Every kid is completely different, okay? How do we take such a small population where the kids vary so much and take a clinical endpoint, for example, behavior that is so subjective anyway? How do you measure that in a way that you could, with a good signal-to-noise ratio, figure out whether a drug was even working? And that's terrifying to me as a parent, right? How could we ever get a drug through if even, it feels very subjective to me, right? These things that you measure for a neurological disease. And I was frustrated that it was a one-way conversation. And I'm sure that's how they're designed, but the other thing that I think is, maybe these meetings are a good thing, and it's good for us to talk to them. Maybe they won't ask drug developers questions like, don't these kids just get better, right? I mean, I would hope they would stop asking those questions, right? But still, I wonder, and this is an open question, does it matter, right? I feel like we go in there and we talk to them, we're very passionate, but when we're not getting feedback from them, there's no deliverable on the behalf of the FDA. Is it a waste of a day? I don't know, right? I go and do it anyway, just because I feel like it's the right thing to do, but I think ultimately you have to develop guidance, something that is, something that they're required to, so it has to be law or something that, some policy that they sign off on, I think. And I don't know, these are just my own opinions. I don't know whether it matters or not, but I would actually be interested in hearing what you guys think about whether going in and talking to them when it's a one-way conversation even matters sometimes. But maybe that's, being in this for 3 years and being a little cynical at this point, so I don't know.
I think what we've seen is that a conversation is better than no conversation.
Sure.
And we have to help guide them along, and we have to also build the capacity of the patient community to take the next steps like PAT and PPMD have done, and some other organizations have, brought that compelling testimony and paired it with rigorous data.
Exactly.
And that's some of the things we heard about yesterday, and I was interested in one of the slides that Indu showed. There was a patient preference study built into one of the platforms, and it's that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
That will help change the conversation from just a listening session to a dialogue. I want to segue from something that you said about the choice you would make if there was sort of something offered up. And one thing that we know is that the benefit risk assessment that each of you will make is dynamic over time, and it also really depends on the features of the situation, the disease you're faced with, many other factors, but the choice is not the same for vaccines as it is for progressive disease, as it is for a chronic condition. And Pat, we had a really interesting conversation last night as we were talking about this panel about how that evolves in DMD. Will you share with us just you know,
Sure.
so to give people an idea of how dynamic it can be.
Sure. So benefit risk changes over time because you have to weigh your options and what you might do with an infant. For instance, if someone said to you, I want you to give your infant 10 shots every day, you might worry about that, right? So that benefit risk equation may look quite different to you than if you have an older child who can talk to you about this and you can rationalize about what the therapy is and what it might do and what your hopes and wishes are. And then later in the adult stage as well, when it becomes that young adult's decision about whether or not they want 10 shots a day. So, but I think that's one piece of this puzzle. The other piece is the effect on families. These diseases are family diseases, so it's not just about what's happening to the patient. It's about the ripple effect, right? When we've discussed with the FDA some measures that in another clinical trial that happened long ago, patients reported that they could write better. And so what does that mean, right? That their writing was more legible, that the ink was darker. Well, that obviously, at least to me, says that they're able to use those fingers and press harder on the pen or pencil. And the FDA was like, okay. But that meant better school performance, right? That meant people could read what they wrote. That meant that they probably had more finger dexterity to do other activities. So another person said, my son rolled over in bed at night and made himself comfortable. Well, you might say to yourself, okay, how do you measure that? But then that person sleeps all night, then you don't sit at the breakfast table and hate each other for the first few minutes because no one can speak. And in my view, that didn't have enough Diet Coke to wake up. And then the school performance is less because this individual is fatigued. And maybe the work performance is really less effective because those parents haven't had a full night of sleep, or maybe a full night of sleep in a long time. I think you get to the other end of the spectrum, and as we use medical tools and interventions to extend the life of people with these debilitating illnesses, then you have older parents. And I can give you an example of one of my dear friends just lost their son who was 46 years old, trached and on a ventilator for the last 17 years. In the last 4 years of his life, his mother was diagnosed with leukemia at 74, his father with dementia. So this is a family that this disease, I don't believe that they caused the leukemia or the dementia, but other complicating factors happen in families that make this benefit-risk equation change over time. And so as a family, you have to weigh this. But for the regulators, we need to understand how will you weigh it, right? How are you going to weigh the benefit risk? Because we can provide all the data we want to them. And if they say, lovely data, next, let's look at the scientific value, then it's not patient engagement truly, right? I think that they have to understand the benefit risk at the particular time, but also across the spectrum of the illness so that, again, these drugs have to be accessible for all and they have to be safe. We have to look at the harms as well as the uncertainty along the way. So I think we have to understand that it's a dynamic and it's basically about the ripple effect on families as well that has to be taken into consideration.
Can I just say one thing? Can I add something?
Sure.
So I talked to a mother of a child who had a metabolic disease, neurologic disease, and you have to understand my son is like the Tasmanian devil. I mean, he just runs around, and, just our house is set up for him, okay? But it would be hard sometimes for me to take him grocery shopping. And this mother had a child who was treated, and she said, I said, how's he doing? And he said, for the first time ever, I could take him through the grocery store holding his hand. I mean, that's huge, right? That is huge. But how do you measure that? And yeah.
Imperfect tools for that kind of thing, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I just put a slide up here that depicts some of the issues that are involved in these kinds of assessment, either informally around the breakfast table where nobody's speaking to each other, or formally in terms of the way studies are designed to measure these kinds of things, whether we're talking about PROs or preference studies. But really, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the conditions that all of you face because they're rare and they're not often as well studied as things that affect more people. And we had a question yesterday at the end of the day about reimbursement issues, and there's no, it's not just the medical issues, as Pat said. There are financial issues involved as well, and there are opportunities for therapies in other countries and out of pocket and off formulary that, again, it's a financial decision as well as a medical one in some of these cases. So you have to look at insurance coverage and reimbursement and, whether you have access geographically to certain things and what kind of support system you have to enable regular trips to the hospital or inpatient care or whatever it is. So this slide, I'm going to lean on Eric for this one. If we step up and away from the personal level of how these decisions get made and look more across a community, as Pat said, the FDA has sort of a responsibility not just to understand what the individual trade-offs might be, but how does the community face that decision? And what are the tools that you, as patient leaders in your community, can use to help sort of get a handle around this? And Eric and the National Health Council had put together, I don't expect anybody to be able to read this. I think you've got copies of it for your deep dive. But this is a great tool and some supporting materials that they've developed, and you'll walk us through what those are designed for.
Sure, and I won't go into too much depth because this will be the topic of my deep dive, but essentially what we put together is a logic model for groups who want to be able to communicate with the FDA, to really bring together the entire spectrum of their patient community's thoughts on benefits and risks, on outcome measures, really about living with the disease. So that's what I'll be talking about in my deep dive, to make sure that they're not asking questions that are inappropriate. You want to come with the information that you think are the questions they should be asking. And also particularly to make sure that you are catching the full breadth of the community, so you're not leaving anyone out and really getting a smaller snapshot of your community.
Great. Another type of tool is the study that Pat and Mark described last evening, a patient preference study. Now this requires social scientists and support of probably external experts beyond what your advocacy team might have. But this is a growing field of interest to help demonstrate and document what things are important to patients in a way that sort of begins to approach the type of data that FDA is used to seeing. And Pat, I'm going to ask you to tell us about the study in a little bit of a capsule and how you did that. You covered it so beautifully yesterday. And again, to revisit how this changed sort of the perspective on what patients were really looking for in terms of their benefits and expectations.
Well, I think we all, inside of ourselves, having an experience with it, with any disease, we have our own sort of best-worst scaling, right, inside of our head. But it's interesting to see what the group experience is, and really important to understand the data so that it can be generalized and interpreted by FDA or others. So we embarked on a benefit risk study because the FDA had said, as we talked to them about the fact that we felt the equation of benefit risk was different in our disease than it was perhaps in other conditions. So we used best worst scaling. We teamed up with, as I mentioned yesterday, the social scientists, and then talked with a group of parents, because who else is and patients, who else is going to help us understand what are their worries? What do you worry about every day? How do you feel about this child every day? What don't you worry about? And it turned out they don't worry about themselves, and they worry about optimal care. And what risks are you willing to think about? We use words like hemorrhage because we felt like that was a pretty big word, and people who weren't familiar with medicine might not be able to understand it, but it also sounded pretty frightening. So an arrhythmia, right? We use that word as well because the definition being the heart is using an abnormal rhythm. However, we also associated arrhythmia with death. So they were able to sort of select through these best worst and make choices, and it was designed to make, you had to make a choice before you could go on. So I think we learned in this best worst scaling the priorities of these patients, which were slowing or halting disease progression, and they preferred that over extending the lifespan. So I think that's a very important lesson to learn, and again, it's across the trajectory. So we had a breadth of 119 parents and the mean being in the middle of about 43 years old with a 12-year-old patient. I expect that if we subset that across, we might see different priorities and different risk, willingness to take on risk.
Yeah, and these are just some of the results from that study that was done. I'm going to just update you on our timing. We're supposed to end at 9, but in their eminent wisdom, the Global Genes folks gave us an hour for our deep dives instead of 45 minutes, and we've decided to take back 15 minutes of that time so we can keep the panel discussion and then open it up before we head into the other rooms. So we were promised to end on time. We won't throw the whole schedule off, but we are reallocating the time that we have. I'm going to jump to this slide. So this is an image that I credit my friend Bennett Levitan at Janssen for, who studies benefit risk in a number of conditions. And I thought this summed it up beautifully, that when there is all this data and all of these compelling testimonies, that it's often not the facts that are in dispute, but the values about those facts. And, you know, it's really interesting to hear these conversations. We've heard a couple of anecdotes this morning about, you know, the regulators might not understand that being able to hold your son's hand and take him to the grocery store is a huge impact on your quality of life, his quality of life, and the family's quality of life. I can offer another example. The Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research recently convened a meeting with payers, and this goes back to the medical and financial issues that are so tightly intertwined. And one of the payers was describing one of the treatments for Parkinson's that their company wasn't really reimbursing that well. And the payer representative said, well, you know, a 30% change in the freeze time, which is when a Parkinson's patient sort of loses the ability to have any motion or mobility at all, a 30% reduction in that just doesn't seem like it's worth the expense of this particular medication. And one of the patients in the room raised his hand and he said, it matters a lot to me when I'm driving. And that changed the dialogue in that room for the rest of the day. I mean, it's simple things like that, but you know, that just aren't factored into these conversations because the facts aren't there and the values often aren't shared. So we have to bring both. And then lastly, before we kind of open it up, the FDA policy, if you think of it in terms of a philosophy or a culture or an approach, kind of swings between the safety side of things and the efficacy side of things, and it's constantly moving. Many of you remember the Vioxx situation. Vioxx, a painkiller, very promising, widely used, millions of people taking that medicine, and after it was on the market and in such wide use, cardiovascular problems began occurring at a more frequent rate, and the drug was withdrawn from the market. For many people, that was their drug. That was what made them functional, and I know many people still miss that drug today, and they can't get it. But that situation and its high-profile nature really swung things in the safety direction. And the 2007 law, FDA, isn't that what they call it? Was very much on the safety side. FDA built up a whole new structure for doing, making sure that the drugs that were approved were safe. We're seeing things move now in the direction of efficacy with more accelerated pathways, things like breakthrough status, these patient perspectives that are seeking to kind of alter the landscape for how regulators think about benefits and risks. But everybody feels like, you know, we're one high-profile mistake away from things going back in the other direction. So it's good to know sort of where things are more globally as you approach FDA with the needs of your community. I'm going to open it up if that's okay, and see what questions we might have before we head into the deep dives, and you'll have a choice, a best-worst scaling exercise to choose one of the four of us to spend the next 45 minutes with.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Bozarth, and I have a daughter that has MPS IV. I also am on the board for the National MPS Society. And I just wanted to share a little bit from my perspective. This last year, my daughter, we went through with the FDA advisory committee to get my daughter's drug approved, which was approved in 2014 in February. So this was great, which there was no other drug treatment for MPS IV ever, and so it was a really exciting time. But I felt compelled to say something because I do feel like the FDA is trying. I really felt that from my standpoint. Actually, I got a call in 2013 from the FDA calling me on my home phone saying, we want to talk to you about your daughter, about MPS IV, what are your perspectives? Tell me a little bit more about your community. So they reached out to me. We did talk about being a patient representative, but I was ruled out because of my leadership in the community, which is okay, because even if you do get ruled out as a patient representative, it doesn't mean you don't have a voice. I continued to move forward. We did listening conferences. I helped the FDA schedule listening conferences with patients in the Morchio community, as well with parents, so that when we did go through the review process for the drug, that they understood a little bit better. I mean, it was clear going through the whole process that they did need a lot of information, and especially from the patients. As we moved forward, we went to the advisory committee, I'm sorry, a little nervous, advisory committee meeting, which was so exciting. And this was a chance for the patient community to really step forward. There was, through a whole day of listening to scientists and the sponsors, talk about the drug, the risks, the benefits, there's anaphylaxis, shock possibilities. What are we seeing, the increase in the 6-minute walk test? It wasn't really maybe that great. But the whole time in the back of the room, I'm thinking, oh my God, it didn't go down. I mean, that is huge. Even if it stayed straight, that's still better than declining, which is what we would expect in our population. So after lunch, they did listen to a handful of patients, parents, and a 10-year-old actually showed up and told their story. And the whole shift of the room and the feeling was swayed in that moment. They were listening, they heard our story, even though this drug is not a cure. We all know it. It didn't fix everything. We're still going to have a zillion surgeries moving forward. We're still going to have a lot of other issues going on, but it did help our children walk through a grocery store without a stroller or being in a cart. It gave our children the ability to go play after school and be on the playground rather than sitting on the bench. So I wanted to share that with everyone to know that I do feel like the FDA is doing a better job. I do feel like they're a little off balance sometimes. And sometimes they might need to be told what questions they should be asking, and just answer it the way that you think that what they need to hear is kind of what we've been doing. But I do encourage you to participate any time that the FDA is asking for our patient community to respond. You've got to get on your email, you've got to send in your comments, because if we don't make that comments, they don't realize that we're listening and that we care. But the more of us that actually make those comments and listen to what the FDA is doing, the more that they are going to realize, wow, this community is loud, they're interested, and we should change, and we should include their perspective.
Thank you, that was tremendous.
I had a question that hopefully you can answer. How do we expect, we talk a lot about benefit risk, and my son has MPS II and is being treated, so we're in the lucky crowd, I guess, but how do we expect them to incorporate benefit risk by disease in a more systematic fashion? Because what I see right now is very anecdotal, and I'm glad they're listening. I'm glad they're doing patient-focused drug development and hearing about our diseases, but I would really like to see them incorporate it more systematically in the early part of the trials that are coming in, and how that's going to work, and how do we expect that to go forward?
Well, at the FDA level, Eric mentioned the structured assessment of benefit risk, which is going to be a tremendous tool. They're implementing that in kind of a staged fashion. First at the later stage, so when a new drug application comes in for marketing approval, that is where we will see that table used for the first time in a way that's both an organizing tool internally for them to really capture what they are seeing in the data, and also as a communications tool with the public. Now, FDA has said it will make that table all completed with the patient view part of its approvals. They haven't decided yet what will happen, whether that will be part of the advisory committee package that goes to the reviewers. It seems silly to me that they wouldn't, but we haven't gotten that agreement yet from FDA. And then how it will be used earlier as sponsors come in with their clinical trials plans, as data comes back from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies kind of along the way to plan that path. They've got sort of a comprehensive approach, but it's still in early days in terms of how they're actually utilizing it. And then we're also hearing from the sponsors that they're trying to recreate that internally so that their systems are in sync with what the FDA will expect to hear from the regulators. Eric, you have anything to add to?
I would just say that, even in cases where they're not seeking that data early on, I would advise everyone here to organize your community and collect that data yourself, or potentially work with drug sponsors to collect that data, share it with FDA. Make sure that you're having those conversations with them even before there might be a product in the pipeline for you, to make sure that they know that ahead of time, so that when something does come to them, they already have a good representation of the community.
Pat used the phrase last night, early and often. Come to the patient advocacy group early and often, and go to the FDA early and often.
I also think when you're doing these surveys of benefit risk, if that's one of the initiatives you undertake, you might collect with others in a pediatric population or an MPS population, because it's likely very similar in these disease trajectories. And so that will lend into the framework that they're building. So if you can say in the pediatric population with this particular systemic disease, the benefit risk data looks like this, then I think that gives them more power to integrate this into their framework.
My name is Sarah. I am from the Narcolepsy Network, and my husband has narcolepsy, so I'm a supporter too. And we were participated in the FDA initiative. And I think for our community, I don't know if we necessarily believe that something grand will come out of it. There's no cure for narcolepsy, just treatment for the symptoms. But I think for us, it definitely showed us that we can have a voice if we join together. We had to work together to become part of the study, and then work together to figure out a way that we were all going to say one message that was going to be understood, as opposed to a bunch of people just talking. So it really gave us encouragement and support that we could do something together that would possibly, make a difference. And also what you were saying, they kept asking about, when my husband goes to doctor's appointment and he starts to talk about what his day's like, and they're like, oh, you have high blood pressure? Great, we have something for that. Okay, they try to find the different things that's wrong that they can treat, but never treating what's really wrong, where we wouldn't need 20 different medications. So I can definitely appreciate that point. But, even if nothing comes, at least they're hearing us, and they know we're here, we're not going away, and we're gonna find something that's gonna help the people that we love.
Thank you for that. And I want to thank you as somebody who participated in the Unite Narcolepsy Initiative. I have to say the MECFS meeting was very well attended. Advocates really participated in that meeting very robustly. There was a lot of comments into what the FDA calls the docket. The HIV meeting was second in the series, and then lung cancer. And both of those meetings were actually very poorly attended. There were only about a dozen or so patients in the room for either one of those meetings. And I can tell you, I met with the FDA after the lung cancer meeting ended, and they said, what in the world is going to happen when we have a rare disease meeting if nobody comes? They felt like the whole thing was going down the tubes. So I sort of made it a personal mission to get involved with the people in the narcolepsy community to make sure that their opportunity was as robust as possible, and that we sort of rescued the FDA's hopes and dreams for being able to take this forward. And I think there have been, tremendous galvanizing of communities. And Pat said this yesterday, the comment that was just made about the one voice being so important, and that is certainly true in all of these settings, but particularly when going to the FDA. Do you want to say anything more on that?
So I think we have to look for common threads, right? Because we all ultimately want the same thing. We want a change in the trajectory of the illness by targeting the main problem. Not all the peripheral things. There hopefully are some tools to deal with the peripheral problems, but really to target the fundamental defect of the disease. So if we're all over the map about what that is or what we want, it makes it confusing. We learned this on the Hill. We learned this in the FDA. So the more we can agree to what are the talking points, pick 2 or 3 talking points, use it as your mantra, say it every day, it really does make a difference.